The Frostborns Debt. Io and Aldrich had never known why the cold never touched her, why she never shivered, why winter felt like home. But when the river froze solid overnight, the snow falling too thick, too fast, she felt it something stirring. And then she saw him standing in the blizzard, silver-eyed and waiting. "You are the reason winter does not end," he murmured, stepping closer. "And now you must set things right." Chapter 1. The Unending Chill. The biting wind whipped at Io and Aldrich's exposed cheeks, carrying with it the sharp sting of snowflakes, yet she felt no discomfort. She stood on the porch of her small cottage, nestled on the outskirts of Oakhaven, watching the swirling white world with a strange sense of familiarity, a peculiar comfort. Winter had always been this way for her, a friend, a confidant, a blanket of serenity. While others huddled inside, seeking refuge from the cold's harsh embrace, Ioan felt at peace. At home. She'd lived in Oakhaven for 5 years, ever since leaving ever since leaving everything behind. She'd found solace in the quiet routine of village life. The gentle rhythm of days spent tending her small herb garden, even in winter. Some hardy plants stubbornly persisted, selling her remedies at the weekly market, and the comforting solitude of her evenings. She was known, if known at all, as the quiet herbalist, the woman who kept to herself, the one who never seemed to shiver, no matter how low the temperature dropped. They whispered about her, of course. Small towns always did. But Ioan had learned to ignore the whispers, to wrap herself in the cloak of her own quiet strength. Today, though, the quiet was different. The usual hush of snowfall was overlaid with a deeper, more profound silence, a stillness that resonated in her very bones. It felt like the world was holding its breath, waiting for what she couldn't say. Even the birds, usually chirping a brave defiance against the winter's grip, were silent. The snow fell with an unnatural ferocity, blurring the line between earth and sky. It wasn't merely falling, it was driven, swirling and eddying as if possessed by some unseen force. The old oak tree at the edge of her property, its branches usually laden with snow, seemed to be straining against the onslaught, its ancient limbs groaning under the weight. Ioan pulled her thick woolen shawl tighter around her shoulders, not out of cold, but out of a growing unease. She'd always found solace in winter's embrace, but this felt different. This felt wrong. The air crackled with an unseen energy, a palpable tension that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. She had just turned to go back inside, convinced that her imagination was playing tricks on her, when the river froze. Not gradually, not over the course of days, or even hours. It froze instantly. One moment, the Oakhaven River was flowing, albeit sluggishly, its dark water reflecting the leaden sky. The next, it was a solid sheet of ice, stretching as far as the eye could see, its surface shimmering with an unnatural, almost ethereal glow. Ioan gasped, her breath catching in her throat. She'd never seen anything like it. The river, the lifeblood of Oakhaven, frozen solid in the blink of an eye. It was impossible, unnatural, and terrifying. A cold dread, a feeling she had never before experienced, gripped her heart. She gripped the wooden railing of her porch, her knuckles turning white. This wasn't just winter. This was something else. Something more. The unnatural silence, the ferocious blizzard, the instantaneously frozen river, it all pointed to something beyond her understanding, something that sent a shiver of primal fear down her spine, a sensation utterly foreign to her being. And then she saw him. He was standing in the heart of the blizzard, seemingly untouched by the swirling snow and the biting wind. He was tall and lean, his silhouette stark against the white backdrop. As he moved closer, she began making out a few more details. His coat, the color of a raven's wing, seemed to absorb the light, making him appear almost two-dimensional, a shadow given form. He moved with a grace that was both mesmerizing and unsettling, like a predator stalking its prey. Ioan couldn't tear her eyes away. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic rhythm against the unnatural stillness of the world around her. Fear, raw and unfamiliar, clawed at her throat. But beneath the fear, There was something else, a flicker of recognition, a strange sense of inevitability. He stopped a few feet from her porch, his head tilted slightly, as if studying her. The snow seemed to part around him, creating a small circle of relative calm in the midst of the storm. And then she saw his eyes. They were silver, not the dull gray of a cloudy sky, but the bright, shimmering silver of polished metal, of moonlight on snow. They held a depth, an ancient wisdom, that seemed to pierce through her, seeing straight into her soul. They were eyes that had witnessed centuries, eyes that held secrets she couldn't even begin to imagine. Eowyn felt a strange pull towards him, a magnetic force that seemed to emanate from his very being. It was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. She wanted to run, to hide, but her feet felt rooted to the spot, her body betraying her fear. He took another step closer, his silver eyes never leaving hers. The wind howled around them, but his voice, when he spoke, was clear and resonant, cutting through the roar of the storm. "You are the reason winter does not end," he murmured, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in the very air around them. "And now, you must set things right." His words, spoken with such quiet intensity, struck her like a physical blow. They resonated with something deep within her, a truth she hadn't known existed, a destiny she hadn't dared to imagine. What did he mean? What did she have to do with the unending winter? With the frozen river? With him? She wanted to ask, to demand answers, but the words caught in her throat, trapped by a mixture of fear and something else. Something that felt strangely like hope. A tiny, fragile spark in the vast, frozen wasteland of her heart. But before she could formulate a single question, a sudden, sharp crack echoed from the frozen river, followed by a low, guttural growl that seemed to emanate from the very depths of the earth. The sound chilled her to the bone, a bone that for the first time in memory actually felt a sliver of winter's coldness. Chapter 2. Silver Eyes in the Storm. The growl, primal and laced with an ancient menace, ripped through the unnatural stillness, shattering the fragile sense of what? Hope. Eowyn couldn't name the feeling that had flickered within her a moment before. Now, only ice-cold terror remained. She took an involuntary step back, her hand flying to her throat, as if to ward off the unseen threat. The man, the silver-eyed stranger, didn't flinch. He simply shifted his gaze, his silver eyes now fixed on the frozen river, his expression unreadable. The growl came again, closer this time, accompanied by the splintering of ice, as if something massive were struggling to break free. "They are coming," he said, his voice low and urgent, but still devoid of any discernible fear. He turned back to Eowyn, his gaze intense. "You must come with me." "Come with you?" Eowyn finally found her voice, though it trembled with fear and disbelief. Who are you? And what is that?" She gestured towards the river, her hand shaking. He didn't answer her questions directly. Instead, he extended a hand towards her, his long, elegant fingers pale against the dark fabric of his coat. The gesture was both an invitation and a command. There is no time for explanations. They hunt what is bound to you, and they will not stop until they have it. Or until they have you. Bound to her? What did that even mean? Eowyn's mind reeled, struggling to make sense of his words. She looked at his outstretched hand, then back at his face, searching for any sign of deception, of malice. But all she saw was an urgency that mirrored her own fear, and a strange protectiveness that seemed to radiate from him. The growling intensified, closer now, and the cracking of the ice grew more frequent, more violent. Eowyn could feel the vibrations through the wooden planks of her porch. Whatever was out there, it was getting closer. And it sounded hungry. Her instinct screamed at her to run, to barricade herself inside her cottage, to hide. But another, deeper instinct, one she hadn't known existed until this very moment, told her to trust him, to take his hand. It was madness. She knew it. She was a woman who valued her solitude, her independence, her carefully constructed life of quiet routine. And yet, here she was, on the verge of abandoning it all, of stepping into the unknown with a complete stranger, a man who exuded an aura of both danger and something else. Something that drew her to him like a moth to a flame. "What are they?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, her eyes still locked on his. "Creatures of the old magic," he replied, his voice tight with barely suppressed tension. "Hunters of the Frostborn." Frostborn. The word resonated with a strange familiarity, echoing the unsettling feeling of the unending winter, of her own unnatural immunity to the cold. It felt significant. Another ear-splitting crack echoed from the river, and this time, Eowyn saw at a dark shape, massive and indistinct, rising from the shattered ice. Its eyes, two glowing embers of red, fixed on her, and a wave of pure, unadulterated terror washed over her. That was all the convincing she needed. With a gasp, Eowyn reached out and took his hand. His grip was firm, strong, and surprisingly warm. A jolt of energy, like a lightning strike, surged through her at his touch, a sensation both shocking and strangely comforting. It was as if a missing piece of herself had suddenly clicked into place. He pulled her towards him, his other arm wrapping around her waist, holding her close. For a moment, their eyes met, and Eowyn saw something flicker in his silver gaze, a hint of relief? Gratitude? Then, without a word, he turned and ran, pulling her along with him, away from the cottage, away from the frozen river, and into the heart of the raging blizzard. The wind howled around them, the snow blinding, but he moved with an uncanny certainty, navigating the treacherous terrain as if he could see through the swirling white chaos. Eowyn stumbled, her legs unused to such speed, but his grip on her never faltered. He held her tight, a shield against the storm, a beacon in the blinding white. She didn't know where they were going or what awaited them. She only knew that she was running for her life, hand in hand with a mysterious stranger, a man who claimed she was the key to ending the unending winter, a woman who, for the first time in her life, felt truly alive. As they ran, she glanced back over her shoulder. Her cottage, her sanctuary, her refuge, was rapidly disappearing into the swirling snow. And on the frozen river, the dark shape was moving, lumbering towards the shore, its red eyes burning with a malevolent hunger. It let out another bone-chilling growl, a sound that promised pain and death. But this time, the sound didn't fill Eowyn with only fear. It filled her with a flicker of defiance, a spark of something she hadn't felt in a long, long time. A reason to run. A reason to fight. A reason to live. The snow was stinging at her skin now, but the feeling was strangely welcome, a reminder that she was not impervious, that she was real, and she was running towards something, even if she didn't know what. Chapter 3. The river's frozen heart. The wind tore at them, a relentless, icy beast trying to rip Eowyn from the stranger's grasp. Snow stung her eyes, blurring her vision, making it impossible to see more than a few feet in front of her. She stumbled again, her foot catching on a hidden root, and she would have fallen if not for his unwavering grip. He didn't slow, didn't speak, just pulled her closer, his body shielding her from the worst of the storm. Eowyn clung to him, her fingers digging into the thick fabric of his coat. Her lungs burned, her legs ached, but she dared not complain. The memory of the creature on the river, its glowing red eyes and guttural growl, spurred her onward. She had no idea where they were going, but she knew, with a chilling certainty, that staying behind meant certain death. After what felt like an eternity, the wind began to lessen, the swirling snow gradually subsiding. They had reached the edge of the forest, the towering pines providing a meager shelter from the storm's fury. The stranger finally slowed his pace, his chest heaving with exertion, though he still maintained a brisk walk. Eowyn, gasping for breath, looked around, trying to get her bearings. The forest was dark and dense, the ancient trees draped in snow, their branches intertwined, creating a canopy that blocked out most of the light. It was a place of shadows and secrets, a world away from the familiar comfort of her cottage. Where are we going?" she managed to ask, her voice hoarse and breathless. He glanced at her, his silver eyes still holding that unsettling intensity, but softened now with concern. To safety, he replied, his voice a low rumble. To a place where they cannot find us. At least not easily. They? Yoan repeated, the word catching in her throat. Those things? From the river? He nodded. They are called the Draugr. Ancient creatures, bound to the frozen waters. They serve the one who controls the ice, the one who holds you bound. His words sent a fresh wave of fear through her, but this time it was mixed with a growing sense of anger. Bound? She was bound to some ice creature? The thought was ludicrous, infuriating. She, Eowyn Aldrich, who had spent years carving out her own independence, her own freedom, was apparently a prisoner of some ancient magic she knew nothing about. I am not bound to anyone, she declared, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and defiance. I don't even know what you're talking about. He stopped walking and turned to face her, his silver eyes searching hers. He reached out and gently brushed a stray strand of hair from her face, his touch surprisingly gentle. Eowyn flinched, not from fear, but from the unexpected intimacy of the gesture. You may not remember, he said softly, but you are. You were born with the power of winter, the ability to control the ice and snow. It is a gift and a curse. A gift that was stolen, twisted, used to create this unending winter. And you are the key to breaking the spell. Eowyn stared at him, speechless. Power of winter? Control the ice and snow? It was absurd. She was an herbalist, a woman who found solace in the quiet rhythm of nature, not a sorceress with magical powers. She shook her head, trying to deny his words, to reject the impossible reality he was presenting her with. I don't understand, she stammered. I've always been normal. Normal? He raised a skeptical eyebrow. You never feel the cold, Eowyn. Winter is a part of you. In your blood. In your very soul. Have you never questioned that? She had, of course. She'd spent years wondering why the cold never bothered her, why she felt so at home in the winter months. She dismissed it as a quirk, a peculiarity, something she couldn't explain. But now, his words resonated with a truth she couldn't ignore. But if what you say is true, she said, her voice barely a whisper, why don't I remember? Why don't I have these powers? He sighed, a hint of sadness in his eyes. Because they were taken from you. Long ago. Before you were even born. A pact was made, a bargain struck, and your power was used to bind the river, to create this eternal winter. And you were the price. The river. The frozen river. It all came back to that. The Draugr, the unending winter, her own strange connection to the cold. It was all connected, somehow, to the river's frozen heart. Who made this pact? She asked, her voice trembling. Who would do such a thing? He hesitated, his gaze shifting away from hers, as if he were reluctant to speak the name. His name is lost to time, he finally said, his voice low and heavy. But his legacy remains. He was a sorcerer of immense power, obsessed with controlling the forces of nature. He sought to bind the river's magic to his will, to create a kingdom of eternal ice. And he succeeded at a terrible cost. And what is your name? Eowyn asked, realizing she still didn't know who her rescuer, her captor, was. He looked back at her, a flicker of something unreadable in his silver eyes. I am Kaelin, he said, his voice soft, almost a whisper. And I am here to help you reclaim what was stolen from you. To help you break the curse and set us all free. Another growl, distant but distinct, echoed through the forest, reminding them that they were not safe, that the hunt was still on. The Draugr were still out there. And they were getting closer. The sound of the ice cracking under unseen weight sent a fresh wave of fear through her. Chapter 4. Whispers of a Forgotten Pact. The growl, though distant, served as a chilling reminder of their precarious situation. Kaelin's hand tightened on Eowyn's arm, a silent signal to move. They continued deeper into the forest, the trees growing taller, the shadows deeper, the silence more profound. The snow had stopped falling, but the air remained bitterly cold, a cold that even Eowyn, for the second time that day, could now feel. "This pact," Eowyn said, her voice breaking the silence, "you said it was made before I was born. How is that possible? How can I be bound by something I had no part in?" Kaelin walked in silence for a few moments, his gaze fixed on the path ahead, as if searching for the right words. "The old magic," he finally said, "is not bound by the same rules as the mortal world. It flows through bloodlines, through generations. It can be inherited, bestowed, or stolen." "Stolen," Eowyn repeated, the word bitter on her tongue. "So, my parents, they were involved in this?" He hesitated again, a flicker of pain crossing his face. "Your mother," he said softly, "was a descendant of the Frostborn, a line of women who possessed the power of winter. She was strong, compassionate, fiercely protective of her people." "Was?" Eowyn asked, a knot of dread forming in her stomach. Kaelin stopped walking and turned to face her, his silver eyes filled with a sadness that seemed to mirror her own. "She died," he said quietly, "trying to protect you. Trying to prevent the sorcerer from taking your power." Eowyn felt a sharp pang of grief, a hollow ache in her chest. She had never known her mother. She had grown up with stories, whispers of a woman who had died when she was just a baby, a woman who had loved her fiercely. But she had never known the truth, the sacrifice her mother had made. "And my father?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Kaelin's expression hardened, his jaw clenching. "He was complicit," he said, the word laced with a barely suppressed anger. "He made the pact with the sorcerer, trading your power for something he desired." Eowyn felt a wave of nausea wash over her. Her own father? He had betrayed her, sold her, before she was even born? The thought was almost too much to bear. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to ward off the sudden chill that had nothing to do with the weather. What did he want?" she asked, her voice trembling. What could possibly be worth sacrificing his own child? Kaelin looked away, his gaze fixed on the distant trees. "A power," he said, his voice flat. "Influence." He craved the sorcerer's favor, the prestige that came with being allied with such a powerful being. Eowyn felt a surge of anger, hot and fierce, burning away the cold dread that had gripped her. Anger at her father, at the sorcerer, at the injustice of it all. She had been robbed of her birthright, her power, her very identity, all because of her father's greed and ambition. "And you?" she asked, turning back to Kaelin. "Where do you fit into all of this? Why are you helping me?" He met her gaze, his silver eyes holding a depth of emotion she couldn't decipher. "I was there," he said quietly. "I witnessed the pact. I saw your mother's sacrifice. And I made a vow. To protect you. To help you reclaim what was stolen." "A vow?" Eowyn repeated, skepticism creeping into her voice. "Why?" "Were you close to my mother?" He hesitated, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his face. "I was bound to her," he said, his voice low, in a way that is difficult to explain. The old magic, it creates connections, bonds that transcend time and space. Bound. The word again. It seemed to be the defining characteristic of her life, a life she was only just beginning to understand. She was bound to the unending winter, to the frozen river, to this mysterious man who claimed to have known her mother. "So you're what?" she asked. "A guardian? A protector?" He smiled, a fleeting, almost sad smile. "Something like that," he said. "I am Kaelin of the Frostwood clan. We were allies of your mother's people. We fought alongside them against the sorcerer. And we failed." "Frostwood clan," Eowyn murmured, testing the name. It was a strange and beautiful one. "Are there others?" "There were," he said, his voice tinged with sorrow. "But most were killed in the battle. Only a few of us remain, scattered, hidden, waiting for the time when the curse could be broken. And that time is now." Eowyn asked, a flicker of hope, fragile but persistent, igniting within her. Kaelin nodded. "The signs are clear," he said. "The river's freezing, the Draugrs awakening, it all points to the weakening of the sorcerer's power. The time to strike is now, while he is vulnerable." Another growl, Closer now, sharper, more menacing, cut through the air. Kalen's hand tightened on her arm. "We must go," he said urgently. "They're getting closer." They walked more briskly now, deeper into the woods. The tangled branches overhead cast shifting, complex shadows on the snow, playing tricks with Eowyn's already strained senses. She felt his tension, felt the urgent press of his hand against hers. They couldn't afford to talk, to linger, only to move and move quickly. Chapter 5. The Touch of Winter's Breath. They moved like shadows themselves, flitting between the ancient trees, their footsteps muffled by the thick layer of snow. Kalen led the way, his senses honed, his body taut with a vigilance that bordered on preternatural. Eowyn followed close behind, her breath catching in her throat, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, sent a jolt of fear through her. The forest seemed to be closing in around them, the darkness growing more oppressive, the silence more profound. The air grew colder, noticeably so, a biting chill that seeped into Eowyn's bones, a sensation she had not known with this intensity until this day. This wasn't the familiar, comforting embrace of winter. This was a predatory cold, a cold that threatened to consume her. Kalen stopped abruptly, his hand raised in a silent warning. Eowyn froze, her eyes scanning the surrounding trees, searching for any sign of movement. She could hear nothing but the whisper of the wind and the frantic beat of her own heart. "They're close," Kalen murmured, his voice barely audible. "We need to find shelter. Somewhere we can prepare." "Prepare? For what?" Eowyn wanted to ask, but the look on his face, the intensity in his silver eyes, silenced her. She knew, instinctively, that whatever was coming, it wouldn't be easy. He led her off the main path, deeper into the tangled undergrowth, towards a cluster of large rocks, partially hidden by a thicket of snow-covered bushes. The rocks formed a small, natural cave, barely large enough for the two of them, but it offered some protection from the elements and, hopefully, from the Draugr. Kalen pushed aside the snow-laden branches, revealing the entrance to the cave. He gestured for Eowyn to enter first. She hesitated for a moment, her fear battling with her trust in him, then ducked inside. The cave was dark and damp, the air thick with the smell of earth and decaying leaves. It was barely large enough to stand upright, and the low ceiling forced them to crouch. Kalen followed her inside, pulling the branches back into place, concealing the entrance. They were shrouded in almost complete darkness, the only light filtering through the small gaps between the branches. Eowyn could barely make out Kalen's silhouette, but she could feel his presence, his warmth, his energy. It was a strange, unsettling feeling, this closeness, this forced intimacy, but it was also strangely comforting. Kalen reached into his coat and pulled out a small, smooth stone, which he held in the palm of his hand. He closed his eyes, murmured a few words in a language Eowyn didn't understand, and the stone began to glow, emitting a soft, ethereal light that illuminated the small space. Eowyn stared at the stone, mesmerized. It was another piece of the puzzle, another glimpse into the magical world that Kalen inhabited, a world she was now a part of, whether she liked it or not. What is that?" she asked, her voice hushed. "A lightstone," Kalen replied, his voice low. "It holds a small spark of magic. Enough to provide light, but not enough to attract unwanted attention." He placed the stone on a small ledge, casting the cave in a soft, flickering glow. Eowyn could now see his face clearly, his features etched with a mixture of weariness and determination. She noticed, for the first time, the fine lines around his eyes, the faint scar that ran along his jawline, the subtle signs of a life lived on the edge, a life of hardship and struggle. "We need to talk," he said, his gaze meeting hers. "About your power. About what you need to do." Eowyn felt a knot of apprehension tighten in her stomach. She knew this was coming, but she still wasn't ready. She wasn't sure she would ever be ready. I don't know if I can," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't feel any power. I don't even know where to begin." Kalen reached out and gently took her hand, his touch sending a familiar jolt of energy through her. His grip was firm, reassuring, and strangely warm. It was that human touch, that grounded and real thing, that anchored her. "It's there," he said softly, his silver eyes holding hers. "Dormant, perhaps, but not gone.
It's a part of you, Eowyn.
It always has been. You just need to awaken it." "Awaken it?" Eowyn repeated, skepticism tinging her voice.
How?
"Do I just wave my hand and command the snow to fall?" He smiled, a fleeting, almost tender smile.
It's not quite that simple, he said.
"But it's not as difficult as you might think. It's about connection. About feeling the energy of winter, the power that flows through you, through the land, through everything." He closed his eyes for a moment, his hand still holding hers. Eowyn felt a strange sensation, a tingling warmth spreading through her hand, up her arm, and into her chest. It was as if his touch was igniting something within her, a spark of something she couldn't quite define. He opened his eyes, his gaze intense. "Focus," he said softly. "Feel the cold, not as an enemy, but as a part of you. Feel the energy of the snow, the ice, the wind. Let it flow through you. Let it awaken." Eowyn closed her eyes, trying to follow his instructions. She focused on the cold air around her, on the faint scent of pine and snow, on the silence of the forest. She tried to feel the energy he spoke of, the power that supposedly resided within her. At first, she felt nothing. Just the familiar cold, the familiar fear, the familiar doubt. But then, slowly, gradually, something began to shift. She felt a tingling sensation in her fingertips, a faint hum in her veins, a subtle warmth spreading through her chest. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A flicker of something different. A hint of the power that Kaelin claimed she possessed. She opened her eyes, her breath catching in her throat. She looked at Kaelin, her gaze questioning. He nodded, a knowing smile on his face. "You feel it," he said softly. "Don't be afraid. Let it grow. Let it flow." Eowyn closed her eyes again, taking a deep breath. She focused on the feeling, on the subtle energy that was now coursing through her. She let it grow, let it expand, let it fill her with its warmth, its power. Suddenly, a gust of wind swept through the cave, extinguishing the lightstone, plunging them into darkness. Eowyn gasped, her eyes flying open, her heart pounding in fear. But then she saw it. A faint, ethereal glow emanating from her own hands, a soft, blue light that illuminated the small space. She stared at her hands, mesmerized, her fear giving way to a sense of wonder, of awe. She had done it. She had awakened something. A loud, guttural roar, close by, shattered the moment of wonder, reminding her of the danger that still lurked outside. They were not safe. Not yet. But for the first time, Eowyn felt a flicker of hope, a spark of confidence. She had a power, a weapon, a chance. And she wasn't going to let it go to waste. A cold breeze brushed her neck, winter's breath, or the breath of something hunting her. Chapter 6. Echoes in the Ancient Grove. The roar, close and menacing, sent a shiver of primal fear down Eowyn's spine, but it was different this time. It wasn't the paralyzing terror of before. This time, it was mixed with a strange sense of anticipation. A thrill, almost, at the prospect of facing the danger, of testing her newfound power. The faint blue glow emanating from her hands was the only source of light in the cave, casting dancing shadows on the rough stone walls. Kaelin was a dark silhouette beside her, his presence a reassuring weight in the suffocating darkness. "They know we're here," he said, his voice low and urgent. "We need to move."
Now.
Eowyn nodded, her mind racing. She extinguished the glow from her hands, a conscious effort that surprised her with its ease. It was as if the power, once awakened, was now a part of her, responding to her will. Kaelin carefully pushed aside the branches concealing the cave entrance, peering out into the forest. The snow had stopped completely, and a sliver of moon peeked through the clouds, casting an eerie, silver light on the snow-covered landscape. "We'll head towards the ancient grove," Kaelin said, his voice barely a whisper. "It's a place of power, a place where the veil between worlds is thin. It might offer us some advantage. Eowyn had heard whispers of the ancient grove, tales told in hushed tones around crackling fires on winter nights. It was said to be a place of magic, a place where the spirits of the forest dwelled, a place where the old gods still held sway. It was a place both revered and feared. They moved swiftly and silently through the forest, Kaelin leading the way, his senses alert for any sign of the Draugr. Eowyn followed close behind, her own senses heightened, her awareness expanded. She could feel the energy of the forest, the pulse of life beneath the snow, the whisper of the wind through the trees. It was as if she were seeing, hearing, feeling the world in a whole new way. The air grew colder as they approached the ancient grove, a palpable chill that seeped into Eowyn's bones, but this time, she welcomed it. She embraced it. It was a part of her, a source of her power. They reached the edge of the grove, a circle of ancient, towering trees, their branches intertwined, forming a canopy that blocked out the moonlight. The air within the grove was still and silent, heavy with an almost palpable sense of ancientness. It felt like stepping back in time, into a world untouched by the modern age. Kaelin stopped at the edge of the circle, his hand resting on the trunk of a massive oak tree. He closed his eyes, murmuring a few words in that same unknown language, his voice resonating with the quiet power of the grove. Eowyn watched him, fascinated. She could feel the energy of the place, a hum of power that vibrated in the very air she breathed. It was both exhilarating and unsettling. He opened his eyes, his gaze meeting hers. "The grove will offer us some protection," he said, "but it will also test us. Be prepared." Test us? What did that mean? Eowyn wanted to ask, but before she could, a low growl echoed from within the grove, followed by the snapping of branches, the heavy thud of footsteps. The Draugr had found them. Kaelin drew a long, slender blade from beneath his coat, the silver metal gleaming in the faint light that filtered through the trees. The blade seemed to hum with a power of its own, a reflection of the magic that permeated the grove. "Stay close to me," he said, his voice low and firm. "And be ready to use your power. They will come for you, Eowyn. They will try to take what is yours." Eowyn nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She took a deep breath, focusing on the energy within her, the cold fire that burned in her veins. She raised her hands, feeling the familiar tingle, the subtle hum of power. Two figures emerged from the shadows, their forms massive and hulking, their eyes burning with that malevolent red glow. They were the Draugr, the creatures of the frozen river, the hunters of the Frostborn. They were even more terrifying up close, their bodies covered in thick, matted fur, their claws long and sharp, their teeth bared in a snarl. They lunged towards Eowyn, their growls echoing through the grove, their intent clear. They wanted her power. They wanted her. Kaelin moved with lightning speed, intercepting the first Draugr, his blade flashing in the dim light. The two figures clashed, a whirlwind of steel and fur, their movements too fast for Eowyn to follow. The second Draugr continued its advance towards Eowyn, its red eyes fixed on her, its claws outstretched. She stood her ground, her fear battling with a newfound determination. She raised her hands, focusing her will, channeling the energy that flowed through her. A blast of icy wind erupted from her hands, hitting the Draugr full force, sending it stumbling backward. The creature roared in anger and surprise, its fur momentarily frosted with ice. It wasn't enough. The Draugr recovered quickly, shaking off the ice, its eyes burning with renewed fury. It lunged again, faster this time, its claws swiping at her. Eowyn dodged the attack, barely avoiding the razor-sharp claws. She unleashed another blast of icy wind, but the Draugr was ready for it, deflecting the attack with a swipe of its massive arm. She was outmatched. She knew it. The Draugr was stronger, faster, more experienced. But she wouldn't give up. She couldn't. She had to fight. For herself. For her mother. For the chance to finally be free. As the Draugr prepared for another attack, Eowyn closed her eyes, seeking a deeper connection to the power within her, to the energy of the grove. She felt it, a surge of ancient magic, flowing through her, empowering her, guiding her. She opened her eyes, her gaze fixed on the draugr. She raised her hands, and this time, it wasn't just icy wind that erupted. It was a torrent of snow and ice, a miniature blizzard that engulfed the creature, blinding it, freezing it, trapping it. The draugr roared in defiance, struggling against the icy prison, but it was no use. The snow and ice continued to swirl around it, solidifying, encasing it in a tomb of frozen magic. Eowyn stood panting, her body trembling with exertion, her hands glowing with that ethereal blue light. She had done it. She had defeated the draugr. But the battle wasn't over. She could hear Kaelin still fighting the other creature, the clash of steel echoing through the grove. And she knew, with a chilling certainty, that this was only the beginning. The sound of Kaelin's blade slicing through the air was followed by a pained yelp and then a heavy thud. Silence descended. Was it over? Or had the draugr Chapter 7? The mark of the Frostborn. The sudden silence was more unnerving than the sounds of battle. Eowyn strained her ears, listening for any sign of Kaelin, her heart pounding in her chest. The draugr she had encased in ice remained frozen, a silent, ominous statue in the center of the grove. "Kaelin?" she called out, her voice trembling slightly. She received no response. Only the whisper of the wind through the ancient trees and the creak of their snow-laden branches. Fear, raw and primal, threatened to overwhelm her. She had to know if he was all right. She took a tentative step towards the area where she had last heard the sounds of fighting, her hands still glowing faintly, ready to unleash another blast of icy wind if necessary. As she rounded a large oak tree, she saw him. Kaelin was standing over the fallen body of the second draugr, his blade dripping with a dark, viscous fluid. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving with exertion, but he seemed unharmed. Relief washed over Eowyn, so potent it almost buckled her knees. She rushed towards him, her fear giving way to a surge of gratitude. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice breathless. He turned to face her, his silver eyes meeting hers. He nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. "I am," he said. "Thanks to you." He sheathed his blade, his gaze shifting to the ice-encased draugr. "You did well," he said, his voice filled with genuine admiration. "You have a natural talent, Eowyn. A power that is remarkable." Eowyn looked at her hands, at the faint blue glow that still emanated from them. She felt a surge of pride, of confidence, a feeling she hadn't experienced in, well, perhaps ever. She had faced her fear, she had fought, and she had won. "It's strange," she said, her voice hushed. "I feel different, stronger, more alive." "That's the power of the Frostborn," Kaelin said.
It's a part of you, Eowyn.
"It always has been. You just needed to awaken it." He walked towards her, his gaze intense. He reached out and gently took her hand, his touch sending that familiar jolt of energy through her. He turned her hand over, examining her palm, his fingers tracing the lines of her skin. "There," he said softly, pointing to a small, almost invisible mark on her palm, a faint, silvery pattern that resembled a snowflake. "The mark of the Frostborn. It's a sign of your lineage, your power, your destiny." Eowyn stared at the mark, mesmerized. She had never noticed it before, but now, in the faint light of the grove, it was clearly visible. It was a tangible proof of her heritage, of the magic that flowed through her veins. What does it mean?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "It means you are the one," Kaelin said, his voice filled with a mixture of awe and reverence. "The one who can break the curse, who can end the unending winter, who can set us all free." The weight of his words settled upon her, a heavy burden of responsibility. She was the one? She was supposed to save them all? The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating.
"But how?"
she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "What do I need to do?" Kaelin released her hand, his gaze shifting towards the frozen river, towards the source of the curse. "We need to find the source of the sorcerer's power," he said. The place where he bound the river's magic. And we need to unbind it. Unbind it? Eowyn repeated, skepticism tinging her voice. How do we even begin to do that? You said the sorcerer's name is lost. How will we find his lair? We follow the river, Kaelin said, his voice firm. The river is the key. It will lead us to him. To his prison. Prison? The word sent a shiver down Eowyn's spine. Was the sorcerer still alive? After all this time? He's alive? She asked, her voice barely audible. Kaelin nodded, his expression grim.
He is trapped, he said.
Bound to the river, just as you are. He cannot die, not until the curse is broken. But he is weakened. His power is fading. That's why the Draugr are stirring. That's why the winter is intensifying. He is losing control. So, we need to find him, Eowyn said, her mind racing. Before what? Before he regains his strength? Before he finds a way to break free, Kaelin corrected. Before he unleashes his full power upon the world. Before he consumes you. Consumes her? The thought was terrifying. But it also ignited a spark of defiance within her, a determination to fight, to survive, to reclaim her life. Then we have no time to waste, she said, her voice firm. Let's go. Kaelin nodded, a flicker of admiration in his silver eyes. Follow me, was all he said. As they turned to leave the clearing, the ice encasing the Draugr cracked, a spiderweb of fractures spreading across its surface. Had she merely delayed it, or was something else at play? Chapter 8. A bond forged in ice. The cracking of the ice, sharp and ominous, echoed through the silent grove, sending a jolt of alarm through Eowyn. She turned back to look at the frozen Draugr, her hand instinctively raising, ready to unleash another blast of icy power. But Kaelin stopped her, his hand gently resting on her arm. It's not the Draugr, he said, his voice low. It's the grove. It's reacting to your power. To the connection. Connection? What connection? Eowyn looked at him, her brow furrowed in confusion. He gestured towards the ice-encased creature. The Draugr are creatures of the frozen river, of the sorcerer's magic, he explained. Your power, it's the opposite. It's the power of the Frostborn, of the natural order. The grove, it recognizes that. It's rejecting the Draugr's presence. As they watched, the cracks in the ice grew wider, deeper, spreading across the surface of the frozen prison. The Draugr, though still encased, seemed to be shrinking, its form becoming less distinct, its edges blurring. It's dissolving it, Eowyn said, her voice filled with a mixture of awe and disbelief. Kaelin nodded. The grove is a place of ancient power, he said. It's cleansing itself. Of the sorcerer's taint. The process was slow, gradual, but inexorable. The ice continued to crack, to melt, to disintegrate, until finally, there was nothing left but a puddle of water on the snow-covered ground, which quickly froze over, leaving no trace of the Draugr's existence. Eowyn stared at the spot where the creature had stood, her mind reeling. The power of the grove, combined with her own, it was incredible. It was terrifying. We need to be careful, Kaelin said, his voice breaking the silence. Your power is growing stronger, Eowyn. But it's also unpredictable. You need to learn to control it, to channel it, before it consumes you. His words echoed her own fears. She could feel the power surging within her, a wild, untamed force that threatened to overwhelm her. She had to learn to control it, to master it, before it was too late. They left the grove, stepping back into the moonlit forest, the air feeling cleaner, somehow, after the cleansing of the Draugr. They walked in silence for a while, Kaelin leading the way, his senses alert for any sign of danger. Eowyn's mind was racing, trying to process everything that had happened. Her newfound power, the mark of the Frostborn, the sorcerer's curse, the frozen river, it was all so much to take in. Kaelin, she said, her voice breaking the silence, you said you were bound to my mother. What did you mean by that? He hesitated, his gaze shifting away from hers, as if he were reluctant to speak of it. It's difficult to explain, he finally said, his voice low. It's a connection, a bond forged by the old magic. It's stronger than friendship, deeper than kinship. Like a soul bond? Yoan asked, the words escaping her lips before she could stop them. She had read about soul bonds in old books, tales of two people connected on a spiritual level, their destinies intertwined, their lives inseparable. Kalen stopped walking and turned to face her, his silver eyes searching hers. He didn't answer her question directly. Instead, he asked one of his own. Have you ever felt incomplete? He asked softly. Like a part of you was missing, a void that could never be filled? Yoan stared at him, speechless. His words resonated with something deep within her, a feeling she had carried with her all her life, a sense of longing, of yearning for something she couldn't name. Yes, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I have. He nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. That's the echo of the bond, he said. A bond that was severed, broken before its time. A bond that is now seeking to be reforged. Reforged? With whom? With him? The thought sent a jolt of something through her, a feeling she couldn't quite define. It was a mixture of fear and anticipation, of confusion and hope. With you? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. He met her gaze, his silver eyes holding a depth of emotion she couldn't decipher. Perhaps, he said softly. The old magic, it works in mysterious ways. It's not always clear. But the connection, it's there, Yoan. I can feel it. And I believe you can too. She could. She could feel it, a subtle hum of energy that resonated between them, a pull, a connection, that was both terrifying and exhilarating. It was as if a missing piece of herself was finally being returned to her. But what does it mean? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. What does it require of us? He reached out and gently took her hand, his touch sending that familiar jolt of energy through her. His grip was firm, reassuring, and strangely comforting. It means, he said softly, that we are bound together, Yoan. By fate, by destiny, by the old magic. It means that we need each other. To break the curse. To save the world. To find our way back to each other. His words hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Yoan stared into his silver eyes, her heart pounding in her chest. She felt a connection to him, a bond that was deeper than anything she had ever experienced before. It was a bond forged in ice, in magic, in destiny. A distant howl pierced the night, a sound chillingly familiar and yet utterly distinct from the Draugr. It was higher-pitched, longer, and resonated with wildness, not malice. What new challenge, or perhaps ally, awaited them? Chapter 9. Shadows of the Past return. The howl, long and mournful, echoed through the stillness of the forest, sending a shiver down Yoan's spine that had nothing to do with the cold. It was a sound she recognized, a sound from her childhood, a sound that spoke of wildness, of freedom, of something else she couldn't quite name. Wolves, Kalen said, his voice low, his hand tightening on hers. But it wasn't a warning. It wasn't laced with the same urgency he displayed with the Draugr. This was different. Are they dangerous? Yoan asked, her voice barely a whisper. He shook his head. Not to us, he said. Not usually. They are creatures of the forest, of the natural order. They are allies of a sort. Allies? Wolves? Yoan looked at him, her brow furrowed in confusion. She had always been taught to fear wolves, to avoid them, to see them as predators, as threats. Allies how? She asked. He released her hand, his gaze shifting towards the direction of the howl. They are part of the Frostwood clan, he explained. Or rather, they are connected to us. We share a bond. A kinship. We can communicate with them. In a way. Communicate with wolves? The idea was incredible. It was another glimpse into the magical world that Kalen inhabited, a world that was becoming increasingly familiar, increasingly real. The howl came again, closer this time, followed by the rustling of leaves, the snapping of twigs, the soft patting of paws on the snow-covered ground. A large, gray wolf emerged from the shadows, its fur thick and lustrous, its eyes glowing with an amber light. It stopped a few feet away from them, its head tilted slightly, as if studying them. Eowyn felt a surge of fear, her instincts screaming at her to run, to hide. But Kaelin stood his ground, his body relaxed, his expression welcoming. He spoke to the wolf, not in words, but in that same unknown language he had used before, his voice low and resonant, filled with a strange music. The wolf responded, not with a howl, but with a soft whimper, a sound that was both mournful and reassuring. Kaelin turned to Eowyn, a faint smile touching his lips. He says they have been watching us, he said. They know about the Draugr.
They know about you.
They know about me? Eowyn repeated, her voice filled with disbelief. He nodded. They are aware of the Frostborn, he said. They have guarded your lineage for generations. They are protectors. Protectors. Just like Kaelin. It seemed she was surrounded by protectors, by beings who were bound to her, by fate, by destiny, by the old magic. Another wolf emerged from the shadows, then another, and another, until they were surrounded by a pack of at least a dozen wolves, their eyes glowing in the dim light, their bodies radiating a sense of wild power. Eowyn felt a strange mixture of fear and awe. She had never been this close to wolves before, had never seen them as anything but a threat. But now, looking into their intelligent eyes, she felt a connection to them, a sense of kinship. Kaelin continued to communicate with the lead wolf, their silent conversation flowing back and forth, a dance of gestures, of sounds, of understanding. Finally, he turned back to Eowyn, his expression serious. They have offered to help us, he said. They know the way to the sorcerer's lair. They can guide us. Guide them? Through the frozen wilderness? To the lair of a powerful, ancient sorcerer? The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating.
But why?
Eowyn asked. Why would they help us? Kaelin smiled, a fleeting, almost sad smile. Because they are bound to the land, he said. Just as you are. Just as I am. They want to see the curse broken, the winter ended, the balance restored. They want to be free.
Free.
The word resonated with Eowyn. It was what she wanted, too. Freedom from the curse, from the fear, from the past. Then we accept their offer, she said, her voice firm, her heart filled with a newfound determination. Kaelin nodded, turning back to the lead wolf. He spoke to it again, his voice filled with gratitude, with respect, with hope. The wolf responded with a low growl, a sound that was both a promise and a warning. Then, it turned and loped away into the forest, the other wolves following close behind. Kaelin turned to Eowyn, his silver eyes meeting hers. We follow them, he said. But we must be careful. The path ahead is dangerous. And the shadows of the past, they are not always what they seem. His words seemed to hold another, deeper meaning. A flicker of memory, painful and fleeting, crossed his features before he masked it. What was he hiding? What shadows haunted him? Chapter 10. The hunt begins. They followed the wolves, moving swiftly and silently through the moonlit forest, the snow crunching softly beneath their feet. The wolves were like shadows themselves, flitting between the trees, their movements fluid and graceful, their senses alert for any sign of danger. Eowyn felt a strange sense of exhilaration, of being a part of something ancient, something wild, something magical. She was running with wolves, following a path laid out by fate, towards a destiny she was only just beginning to understand. Kaelin walked beside her, his presence a reassuring weight, his silence a comfortable companion. She glanced at him, studying his profile, the strong lines of his jaw, the faint scar that ran along his cheekbone, the silver eyes that seemed to hold the secrets of the ages. Kaelin, she said, her voice breaking the silence, what did you mean about the shadows of the past? Not always being what they seem? He hesitated, his gaze shifting away from hers, as if he were reluctant to speak of it. The past, it has a way of haunting us, Eowyn, he finally said, his voice low. Of shaping us, of defining us. But sometimes the memories we hold, the truths we believe, they are not always accurate. They can be distorted. By time, by fear, by regret. What are you trying to say? Eowyn asked, her brow furrowed in confusion. He stopped walking and turned to face her, his silver eyes searching hers. I'm saying that there are things you don't know, Yoan, he said softly. Things about your past, about your family, about me. Things that might change the way you see things. What things? Yoan asked, her voice trembling slightly.
Tell me.
He sighed, a hint of sadness in his eyes.
Not now, he said.
Not yet. There is too much at stake. We need to focus on the task ahead. On finding the sorcerer. On breaking the curse. But Eowyn began, wanting to protest, to demand answers. He silenced her with a gentle touch, his fingers brushing against her cheek. Trust me, Eowyn, he said softly. I will tell you everything. In time. But for now we need to focus on surviving. On reaching the river source. She wanted to argue, to push him for answers, but she knew he was right. They couldn't afford to be distracted, to be caught up in the past. They needed to focus on the present, on the danger that lay ahead. All right, she said, her voice barely a whisper. But you promise you'll tell me? Eventually? He nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. I promise, he said. They continued walking, following the wolves, the silence between them now filled with unspoken questions, with unanswered secrets, with a growing sense of unease. The forest grew darker, denser, the trees taller, their branches intertwined, blocking out most of the moonlight. The air grew colder, a palpable chill that seeped into Eowyn's bones, a reminder of the unending winter, of the sorcerer's power. Suddenly, the wolves stopped, their bodies tense, their ears pricked, their eyes fixed on something ahead. Kalen stopped beside them, his hand reaching for the hilt of his blade, his senses alert. Eowyn felt a surge of fear, her heart pounding in her chest. She strained her ears, listening for any sign of danger, but she could hear nothing but the whisper of the wind and the soft breathing of the wolves. What is it? She whispered, her voice barely audible. I don't know, Kalen replied, his voice low.
But they sense something.
Something close. He moved forward cautiously, his blade drawn, his body poised for action. Eowyn followed close behind, her hands glowing faintly, ready to unleash her power if necessary. They reached a small clearing, a circle of open space surrounded by towering trees. The moonlight filtered through the branches, casting an eerie, silver light on the snow-covered ground. And then they saw it. In the center of the clearing, standing motionless, its eyes glowing with a malevolent red light, was another draugr. But this one was different. It was larger, more imposing, its fur thicker, its claws longer, its teeth bared in a snarl that seemed to radiate pure hatred. It was also surrounded by a swirling vortex of snow and ice, a miniature blizzard that seemed to emanate from its very being. A frostbound, Kalen said, his voice tight with barely suppressed tension. A draugr enhanced by the sorcerer's power. More dangerous. More resilient. The frostbound roared, a sound that shook the very ground beneath their feet, a sound that promised pain and death. It lunged towards them, its claws outstretched, its eyes burning with fury. The hunt had begun. Kalen met the frostbound's attack, his blade flashing in the dim light, deflecting the creature's claws. The two figures clashed, a whirlwind of steel and fur, their movements too fast for Eowyn to follow. The wolves, snarling and snapping, circled the clearing, trying to distract the frostbound, to create an opening for Kalen. But the creature was too powerful, too focused, its attention solely on Kalen. Eowyn knew she had to do something. She couldn't just stand there and watch. She had to help. She raised her hands, focusing her will, channeling the energy that flowed through her. A blast of icy wind erupted from her hands, hitting the frostbound full force, sending it stumbling backward. The creature roared in anger and surprise, its fur momentarily frosted with ice. But it recovered quickly, shaking off the ice, its eyes burning with renewed fury. It turned its attention towards Eowyn, its gaze filled with a terrifying intensity. It recognized her power, her connection to the Frostborn, her threat. It lunged towards her, its claws swiping at her, its intent clear. It wanted to kill her, to silence her, To end her, Eowyn dodged the attack, barely avoiding the razor-sharp claws. She unleashed another blast of icy wind, but the Frostbound was ready for it, deflecting the attack with a swipe of its massive arm. It was stronger than the previous Draugr, faster, more powerful. She wasn't sure she could defeat it, but she had to try. She had to fight. She felt a surge of power within her, a connection to the wolves, to the forest, to the old magic. She closed her eyes, drawing on that power, channeling it, focusing it. She opened her eyes, her gaze fixed on the Frostbound. She raised her hands, and this time, it wasn't just icy wind that erupted. It was a torrent of snow and ice, a miniature blizzard that engulfed the creature, blinding it, freezing it, trapping it. But this time something was different. The snow and ice, they weren't just freezing the Draugr. They were changing it. The creature, as it began freezing, was no longer struggling, and the red was fading from its eyes. What had she done? Chapter 11. Betrayal in the Blizzard. The Frostbound, encased in Eowyn's blizzard, thrashed less and less, the furious red glow fading from its eyes, replaced by a dull, lifeless gray. The swirling snow and ice, instead of simply freezing the creature, seemed to be drawing something out of it. A dark, viscous mist, like smoke, seeped from the Draugr's form, dissipating into the air, leaving behind only a shell. As the last of the mist vanished, the ice shattered, revealing not the monstrous form of the Draugr, but a human. Or what was once human. A gaunt, emaciated figure, clad in tattered furs, collapsed onto the snow, unmoving. Eowyn stared in shock, her breath catching in her throat. She hadn't just defeated the Draugr, she had released him. Kaelin, having witnessed the transformation, lowered his blade, his expression a mixture of awe and horror. He approached the fallen figure cautiously, his gaze fixed on the unmoving form. "It can't be," he whispered, his voice barely audible. He knelt beside the figure, gently turning him over. Eowyn gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The man's face, though gaunt and weathered, was familiar. Hauntingly familiar. She had seen that face before, in faded portraits, in whispered stories, in dreams. "Father?" she whispered, the word a choked sob. Kaelin looked up at her, his silver eyes filled with a profound sadness, a deep, unspoken pain. "Eowyn," he began, his voice trembling slightly. But before he could say anything more, the man's eyes flickered open. They were not the malevolent red of the Draugr, but a pale, washed-out blue, filled with a mixture of confusion and recognition. "Eowyn?" he rasped, his voice weak and hoarse. "Is that you?" Eowyn rushed to his side, kneeling beside him, tears streaming down her face. "Father," she repeated, her voice choked with emotion. What happened to you?" He tried to speak, but his voice failed him. He coughed, a weak, rattling sound, his body trembling with exhaustion. Kaelin placed a hand on the man's shoulder, his expression grim. "He was taken," he said softly, "by the sorcerer. Years ago. He was transformed into that." He gestured towards the shattered remnants of ice, the remnants of the Draugr.
"But why?"
Eowyn asked, her voice trembling. Why would the sorcerer do this? What did he want from him? Kaelin hesitated, his gaze shifting away from hers, as if he were reluctant to speak the truth. He wanted information. He finally said, his voice low. "About the Frostborn. About your mother. About you." "But my father, he betrayed me," Eowyn said, her voice filled with a mixture of confusion and anger. "You said he made the pact. He sold my power." Kaelin nodded, his expression filled with a deep, unspoken sorrow. "He did," he said quietly. "But he was not himself. The sorcerer, he twisted his mind, his will. He made him believe that it was the only way to protect you. Protect her? By betraying her? By selling her power? By becoming that?" The thought was ludicrous, infuriating. Eowyn's father, his eyes filled with a desperate plea, reached out and weakly grasped her hand. "Forgive me," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I was wrong. Tears streamed down Eowyn's face, a mixture of grief, anger, and pity. She looked at her father, this broken, emaciated man, this shell of the person he once was, and she felt a surge of something she couldn't quite name. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was understanding. I don't understand, she said, her voice trembling. How could you do this? How could you betray us? He tried to speak again, but his voice failed him. He closed his eyes, his body shaking with a silent sob. Kaelin placed a hand on Eowyn's shoulder, his touch a reassuring presence. He was manipulated, Eowyn, he said softly, by a power far greater than his own. He was a victim, just as you were. A victim? Her father? The man who had betrayed her, who had sold her power, who had become a monster. It was hard to accept, hard to forgive. A sudden gust of icy wind swept through the clearing, extinguishing the faint blue glow that had emanated from Eowyn's hands, plunging them into near darkness. The wolves, who had been watching silently, began to growl, their bodies tense, their eyes fixed on something behind Eowyn. Betrayal cut deeper than she could imagine. The sound that followed, the soft, familiar tone, was impossible. So touching. A father-daughter reunion. The voice was Kaelin's, but it lacked all warmth, all subtly. And it came from behind her. Chapter 12. The warmth of a hidden flame. The voice, Kaelin's yet chillingly devoid of warmth, sent a jolt of icy terror through Eowyn. She whirled around, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind reeling in disbelief. Standing a few feet away, bathed in the pale moonlight, was Kaelin. But it wasn't her Kaelin. This Kaelin's eyes, though silver, held no kindness, no compassion, no love. They were cold, calculating, filled with a chilling amusement. His smile was a cruel mockery, a twisted parody of the gentle smile she had come to trust. The Kaelin beside her father, the Kaelin who had held her hand, who had comforted her, who had loved her, remained silent, his expression unreadable, his eyes fixed on the impostor.
Who are you?
Eowyn stammered, her voice trembling, her gaze darting between the two Kaelins, her mind struggling to make sense of the impossible. The impostor Kaelin chuckled, a low, guttural sound that sent shivers down her spine. Don't you recognize me, Eowyn? He said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. I am Kaelin. Or rather, I was Kaelin. Before the sorcerer remade me. Remade him? What did that mean? Was this the sorcerer? Possessing Kaelin's body? Using his voice? His memories? You're the sorcerer, Eowyn whispered, her voice barely audible. He smiled, a cruel, triumphant smile. Indeed, he said. And you, my dear Eowyn, are the key. The key to my freedom. The key to my ultimate power. He took a step towards her, his hand outstretched, his fingers long and skeletal, his touch promising pain and oblivion. The real Kaelin, the one beside her father, finally moved. He stepped in front of Eowyn, shielding her from the sorcerer, his body tense, his hand reaching for the hilt of his blade, which, strangely, was still sheathed. Don't touch her, he said, his voice low and dangerous, a voice Eowyn had never heard before, a voice filled with a raw, primal fury. The sorcerer laughed, a mocking, disdainful sound. And what will you do, Kaelin? He said, his voice dripping with contempt. You are weak, powerless, a shadow of your former self. You cannot stop me. I may be weak, the real Kaelin said, his voice unwavering, but I will not let you harm her.
I made a vow
to protect her, and I will keep that vow, even if it costs me my life. He drew his blade, the silver metal gleaming in the moonlight. But it wasn't the same blade he had used before. This blade was different. It was darker, almost black, and it seemed to absorb the light, rather than reflect it. It radiated a cold, deadly power, a power that was both terrifying and strangely familiar. The sorcerer raised an eyebrow, a flicker of surprise, crossing his face. Interesting, he said. A shadow blade. I didn't know you possessed such power. There are many things you don't know about me, the real Kaelin said, his voice cold and hard. He lunged towards the sorcerer, his blade flashing in the dim light, a blur of dark steel. The two figures clashed, a whirlwind of movement, their blades meeting with a deafening clang, sparks flying in the darkness. Eowyn watched in stunned silence, her mind reeling, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't believe what was happening. Kaelin, her Kaelin, fighting the sorcerer, who was possessing another Kaelin. It was a nightmare, a twisted, impossible reality. Her father, weak and trembling, reached out and grasped her hand, his grip surprisingly strong. "Owen," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "You must stop him. You are the only one who can." She looked at him, her eyes filled with tears.
"But how?"
she asked, her voice trembling. I don't know if I'm strong enough." "You are," he said, his voice firm, his eyes filled with a desperate plea. "You have the power of the Frostborn, the power of your mother. Use it,
Eowyn.
use it to save us all." His words ignited a spark within her, a flicker of hope, a surge of determination. She had to fight. She had to protect Kaelin, her father, the world. She had to stop the sorcerer. She closed her eyes, focusing her will, channeling the energy that flowed through her, the cold fire that burned in her veins. She felt the connection to the wolves, to the forest, to the old magic. She drew on that power, letting it fill her, empower her, guide her. She opened her eyes, her gaze fixed on the sorcerer, who was now locked in a deadly dance with Kaelin. She raised her hands, and this time, it wasn't just icy wind or snow that erupted. It was a pure, raw energy, a blinding white light that illuminated the clearing, pushing back the shadows, banishing the cold. The sorcerer cried out, a scream of pain and fury, his body momentarily recoiling from the light. Kaelin, too, shielded his eyes, momentarily blinded by the intensity of the power. But he didn't falter. It was as though he had expected this. Eowyn felt a surge of something she couldn't quite name. It wasn't just power, it was warmth. A warmth that spread through her, melting the ice, banishing the fear, filling her with hope. It was the warmth of a hidden flame, a flame that had been dormant within her, waiting to be ignited. A flame that represented everything the sorcerer was not. And with that warmth came a clarity. She knew what to do. Chapter 13. Scars of the Soul. The blinding light emanating from Eowyn intensified, pushing back the encroaching darkness, forcing the sorcerer to shield his eyes, his borrowed form writhing in apparent agony. The air crackled with energy, a palpable force that seemed to vibrate with the very essence of life, of warmth, of hope. Kaelin, though momentarily blinded, lowered his arm, his true silver eyes fixed on Eowyn, a flicker of pride crossing his face. He seemed to know, instinctively, what she was doing, what she was becoming. Eowyn focused her will, channeling the power that surged through her, directing it towards the sorcerer, towards the false Kaelin, towards the twisted, corrupted form that held the ancient evil captive. "You have no power here," she declared, her voice ringing with newfound authority, her voice resonating with the ancient power of the Frostborn. "This is my land, my heritage, and I will not let you defile it." The sorcerer, his Kaelin form contorted in pain, snarled, a guttural sound that was both a curse and a challenge. "You are a fool, girl," he spat, his voice distorted, the Kaelin veneer cracking, revealing glimpses of the monstrous entity beneath. "You cannot defeat me. I am ancient. I am powerful. I am eternal." "You are trapped," Eowyn countered, her voice unwavering, her resolve hardening with each passing moment. "Bound to this land, weakened, fading. Your time is over. The winter will end." She raised her hands higher, the light intensifying, the warmth spreading, reaching out like tendrils of a benevolent fire, seeking to consume the darkness, to heal the wounds, to restore balance. The sorcerer screamed, a sound of pure, unadulterated agony, as the light enveloped him, searing his borrowed flesh, forcing him to release his hold on Kaelin's form. The false Kalen collapsed to the ground, his body convulsing, his eyes rolling back in his head. The dark, viscous mist, the essence of the sorcerer, began to seep from his form, swirling and writhing, seeking to escape, to find another host, another vessel. But Eowyn would not allow it. She focused her will, channeling the warmth, the light, the power of the Frostborn into a concentrated beam, directing it towards the escaping mist, towards the essence of the sorcerer. The mist shrieked, a sound of pure terror, as the light struck it, burning it, dissolving it, consuming it. It struggled, it writhed, it fought, but it was no match for the power of the Frostborn, for the warmth of the hidden flame that burned within Eowyn. Slowly, gradually, the mist dissipated, fading away, vanishing into nothingness, leaving behind only silence. The clearing was bathed in the soft, ethereal glow of Eowyn's power. The darkness vanished, the cold receding, the air filled with a sense of peace. Eowyn lowered her hands, her body trembling with exhaustion, her energy depleted, but her heart filled with a sense of triumph. She had done it. She had defeated the sorcerer. She had saved them all. She turned to Kalen, her true Kalen, who was now standing, his shadow blade lowered, his expression a mixture of awe and relief. He looked at her, his silver eyes filled with a love, a respect, a devotion that sent a warmth spreading through her, a warmth that had nothing to do with magic and everything to do with connection. He rushed to her side, embracing her, holding her tight, his body trembling against hers. "You did it, Eowyn," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "You saved us."
You saved me.
She clung to him, burying her face in his shoulder, tears streaming down her face, tears of relief, of joy, of love. She had found her power, her purpose, her destiny. And she had found it with him. They stood there for a long moment, embraced in the silence of the clearing, the wolves watching silently, their eyes glowing with a newfound respect, their bodies radiating a sense of peace. But the peace was shattered by a weak, rasping cough. Eowyn and Kalen turned to see her father, still lying on the ground, his body frail and emaciated, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and regret. Eowyn rushed to his side, kneeling beside him, taking his hand in hers. "Father," she said softly, her voice filled with a tenderness she hadn't known she possessed. He looked at her, his pale blue eyes filled with tears. You saved me," he whispered, his voice hoarse. You forgave me." Eowyn began, unsure of what to say. Could she truly forgive him? For the betrayal, for the pain, for the years of suffering? He squeezed her hand weakly. "I know I don't deserve it," he said, his voice barely audible. "But thank you." He closed his eyes, a faint smile touching his lips. His breathing grew shallow, his grip on her hand loosening. "Father?" Eowyn said, her voice filled with alarm. "Father, stay with me." But it was too late. His body went limp, his hand falling from hers, his eyes staring blankly at the sky. He was gone. Eowyn stared at his lifeless form, tears streaming down her face, her heart aching with a grief she hadn't expected to feel. She had lost him again, this time for good. But this time it was different. This time there was closure. There was understanding. Kalen knelt beside her, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "He's at peace now, Eowyn," he said softly. "Free from the sorcerer's grasp. Free from the shadows of the past." Eowyn nodded, her tears falling silently onto her father's still face. She had lost him, but she had also found him. And she had found herself. She had found her power, her purpose, her love. The false Kalen began to stir on the ground, a soft groan escaping his lips. But this was not the sorcerer's return. This was different. Chapter 14. The Price of Freedom. The figure on the ground, the one who had worn Kalen's face, groaned again, his body stirring, his eyes fluttering open. He blinked, his gaze unfocused, his expression confused. He looked around, his eyes darting between Eowyn, Kalen, and the lifeless form of her father. What happened? he asked, his voice weak and hoarse, his accent different. Not Kalen's, but familiar somehow. Ioan stared at him, her mind reeling. It wasn't the sorcerer. It wasn't Kalen. It was someone else. Someone trapped. Kalen knelt beside him, his expression a mixture of caution and pity.
Who are you?
He asked, his voice gentle but firm. The man struggled to sit up, his body trembling with exhaustion. He looked at Kalen, his eyes widening in recognition. Kalen? He whispered, his voice filled with disbelief. Is that you? Kalen nodded, his gaze searching the man's face, trying to place him, to understand. Yes, he said. But who are you? The man looked down at his hands, at his clothes, at his body. He touched his face, his fingers tracing the lines of Kalen's features, his expression a mixture of horror and despair. I don't understand, he said, his voice trembling. I was fighting. In the Great War. Against the sorcerer's forces. And then darkness. Nothingness. And now I'm here. In your body? The Great War? The sorcerer's forces? Ioan remembered Kalen's words about the battle, about the Frostwood clan, about the past. This man, he was a soldier? From that time? What is your name? Ioan asked, her voice soft, her heart filled with a strange mixture of pity and hope. He looked at her, his eyes meeting hers. My name is Alaric, he said. Alaric of the Silverwood clan. Silverwood clan? Ioan had never heard of them. But Kalen, his eyes widened, his expression shifting from confusion to recognition. Alaric? He said, his voice filled with disbelief. Alaric, my brother? Brother? Kalen had a brother? A brother who had been trapped? For centuries? Inside his own body? Alaric stared at Kalen, his eyes searching his face, his mind struggling to comprehend the impossible. Kalen? He repeated, his voice trembling. Is it truly you?
But how?
You were just a boy.
When I last saw you.
Kalen nodded, tears welling up in his eyes. It is me, Alaric, he said, his voice choked with emotion. It's a long story. He reached out and embraced Alaric, holding him tight, his body trembling with a mixture of relief, joy, and sorrow. He had found his brother, his long-lost brother, after centuries of separation. Ioan watched them, her heart aching with a mixture of happiness for Kalen and a profound sadness for Alaric, for the life he had lost, for the time he had missed. How is this possible? Alaric asked, his voice muffled against Kalen's shoulder. How can I be in your body? Kalen pulled back, looking at Alaric, his expression filled with a deep, unspoken sorrow.
The sorcerer, he said softly. He did this to you.
He trapped your soul, your essence, inside me. He used your power.
To fuel his own.
My power? Alaric repeated, his brow furrowed in confusion. But I was just a soldier. I had no special abilities. You were a conduit, Kalen explained. A vessel. You had a connection to the old magic, a connection that the sorcerer exploited. He used you to channel his power, to control the elements. Alaric stared at him, his mind reeling. He had been used, manipulated, trapped, for centuries, his soul a prisoner inside his own brother's body. The injustice of it all was overwhelming.
But why?
He asked, his voice trembling. Why me? Kalen hesitated, his gaze shifting away from Alaric's, as if he were reluctant to speak the truth. Because you were strong, he finally said, his voice low. And, because you were close to me. He knew that it would hurt me.
To see like this.
Alaric looked at Kalen, his eyes filled with a mixture of understanding and forgiveness. He had been a pawn, a victim, in a battle between two powerful forces, a battle that had spanned centuries. And the sorcerer? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. Is he gone? Ioan stepped forward, meeting Alaric's gaze. He is, she said, her voice firm. I defeated him. With Kalen's help. And with the power of the Frostborn. Alaric looked at her, his eyes widening in recognition. The Frostborn, he whispered, his voice filled with awe. You are the one who was prophesied. To break the curse. Ioan nodded, her heart filled with a mixture of pride and sadness. She had broken the curse, she had defeated the sorcerer, but at a great cost. Her father was dead. Alaric had lost centuries of his life. And Kaelin had carried his brother's soul within him, all this time, unaware of the burden he bore. The price of freedom was high, but it was worth it. Alaric, still getting his bearings, looked between Eowyn and Kaelin with an expression Eowyn couldn't quite read. He reached out, taking one of Eowyn's hands, and then one of Kaelin's. A faint warmth seemed to pass between them, a sense of completion, and a sense of beginning. Chapter 15. A Dance with Destiny. Alaric's touch, a connection between Eowyn and Kaelin, sent a surge of warmth through them both, a feeling of completion, of unity, of destiny. It was as if the three of them were linked, bound together by fate, by the old magic, by the past. Alaric looked at them, his eyes filled with a newfound understanding, a deep, unspoken wisdom. "The curse is broken," he said, his voice soft but firm. "The sorcerer is gone. But the balance has been disrupted. The land is still wounded. It needs to heal." Eowyn nodded, her heart filled with a sense of responsibility. She had broken the curse, but her task was not yet complete. She had to help the land heal, to restore the balance, to bring back the spring.
"How?"
she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "How do we heal the land?" Alaric smiled, a faint, almost sad smile.
"You are the Frostborn," he said.
"You have the power to control the elements, to command the winter. You must use that power, to thaw the frozen heart of the river, to awaken the spring." Thaw the frozen heart of the river? It sounded impossible, but she had faced impossible odds before. She had defeated a powerful sorcerer, she had freed Alaric's soul, she had found her power. She could do this. I will try," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "But I don't know if I'm strong enough. I've only just begun to understand my power." Kaelin placed a comforting hand on her shoulder, his touch sending a surge of strength and love through her. "You are strong enough, Eowyn," he said, his voice firm. "You have the power of the Frostborn, the power of your mother, the power of love. You can do this. And I will be with you, every step of the way." His words, his presence, his love, gave her the courage she needed. She would not face this challenge alone. She had Kaelin, she had Alaric, she had the wolves. She looked at Alaric, a question in her eyes. What will you do?" she asked. "Now that you're free?" He smiled, a genuine smile, a smile that reached his eyes, a smile that spoke of hope. "I will help you," he said. "I may not have the power of the Frostborn, but I have knowledge. Knowledge of the old ways, of the ancient magic of the land. I can guide you. I can teach you." Eowyn felt a surge of gratitude, of relief. She would not be alone. She had 2 allies, 2 brothers, 2 protectors, to help her on her journey. They left the clearing, leaving behind the lifeless form of Eowyn's father, a silent testament to the price of freedom. The wolves, who had been watching silently, fell into step beside them, their presence a reassuring weight, their loyalty a silent vow. They walked towards the river, towards the source of the curse, towards the frozen heart that needed to be thawed. The air was still cold, the ground still covered in snow, but there was a change. A subtle shift in the energy, a faint hint of warmth, a whisper of hope. As they walked, Alaric began to share his knowledge, his memories, his wisdom. He spoke of the old ways, of the ancient magic, of the connection between the land and its people, of the balance that had been disrupted, of the healing that needed to take place. He taught Eowyn about the different aspects of her power, about the ways to channel it, to control it, to use it for good. He taught her about the language of the forest, the whispers of the wind, the secrets of the snow, the magic of the earth. Kaelin listened silently, his gaze fixed on Eowyn, his heart filled with pride, with love, with hope. He had watched her grow, transform, become the woman she was always meant to be. The Frostborn, the savior, the queen. They reached the river, the frozen, lifeless river that had been the source of the unending winter. It was a vast expanse of white, a desolate landscape of ice and snow, a monument to the sorcerer's power. Eowyn stood on the bank, looking out at the frozen expanse, her heart filled with a mixture of fear and determination. This was it. This was the final challenge. This was her destiny. She closed her eyes, taking a deep breath, focusing her will, channeling the energy that flowed through her, the power of the Frostborn, the power of her mother, the power of love. She felt the connection to the land, to the river, to the frozen heart that beat beneath the ice. She felt the pain, the suffering, the longing for release. She opened her eyes, her gaze fixed on the center of the river, on the spot where the sorcerer's power had been concentrated, on the place where the curse had begun. She raised her hands, and this time, it wasn't just energy that erupted. It was everything. The warmth, the light, the power, the love. It flowed from her, a torrent of pure, raw magic, directed towards the frozen heart of the river. The ice began to crack, to groan, to melt. The air grew warmer. The snow began to disappear. The river began to flow. Slowly, gradually, the frozen heart of the river began to thaw, the ice giving way to water, the snow giving way to life. The sound of rushing water filled the air, a symphony of renewal, of rebirth, of hope. Eowyn stood on the bank, her body trembling with exhaustion, her energy depleted, but her heart filled with triumph. She had done it. She had thawed the frozen heart of the river. She had awakened the spring. Kaelin and Alaric stood beside her, their arms around her, their bodies supporting hers, their hearts filled with love, with gratitude, with joy. They had faced the darkness. They had fought the shadows. They had won. And as they stood there, on the bank of the reborn river, a single, perfect snowflake landed on Eowyn's outstretched palm. It didn't melt. It shimmered, and then it transformed into a single, perfect spring flower. Chapter 16. The Unveiling of Secrets. The single spring flower, a vibrant bloom resting on Eowyn's palm, was a symbol of hope, of renewal, of the victory they had fought so hard to achieve. It was a testament to Eowyn's power, to her connection to the land, to her destiny. Kaelin and Alaric looked at the flower, their eyes filled with awe, with gratitude, with love. They had witnessed the impossible, the return of spring after centuries of unending winter, the triumph of life over death. Eowyn smiled, a genuine smile, a smile that reached her eyes, a smile that spoke of peace. She had done it. She had broken the curse. She had healed the land. She had found her purpose. But there were still questions, unanswered secrets, hidden truths that lingered in the shadows, waiting to be revealed. As they stood on the bank of the reborn river, the first rays of the rising sun peeked over the horizon, casting a warm, golden glow on the landscape. The snow had melted, revealing patches of green grass. The trees were budding. The air was filled with the sounds of birdsong, the scent of spring. "It's beautiful," Eowyn whispered, her voice filled with awe. Kaelin nodded, his arm tightening around her, his touch a reassuring presence.
"It is," he said.
"And it's all thanks to you." "Not just me," Eowyn said, turning to look at him, her eyes filled with gratitude.
"You were with me
every step of the way. And Alaric, too." She turned to Alaric, who was standing a few feet away, gazing out at the river, his expression a mixture of wonder and sadness. "Alaric," Eowyn said softly, "thank you. For your guidance, for your knowledge, for your help." He turned to her, a faint smile touching his lips. "It was my honor," he said, his voice filled with sincerity.
"To serve the Frostborn.
To help restore the balance."
"But what now?"
Eowyn asked, her gaze shifting between Kaelin and Alaric. "What happens to us?" Alaric looked at Kaelin, a silent question in his eyes. Kaelin hesitated, his gaze shifting away from Eowyn's, as if he were reluctant to speak the truth. "There are things you still don't know, Eowyn," he finally said, his voice low. "Things about Alaric."
"About me."
"About our connection." Eowyn felt a knot of apprehension tighten in her stomach. She had known there were secrets, hidden truths, but she had pushed them aside, focusing on the task at hand, on breaking the curse. But now the time had come to face them. "Tell me," she said, her voice firm, her gaze unwavering. I'm ready. Kaelin took a deep breath, his gaze meeting hers. Alaric is not just my brother, he said softly. He is my twin.
Twin?
Ioan stared at them, her mind reeling. They looked nothing alike. Kaelin, with his dark hair and silver eyes, Alaric, with Kaelin's former features, but with a different essence. But how? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. You look so different. The sorcerer, Alaric said, his voice filled with a deep, unspoken sorrow.
He changed me.
He twisted my form, my essence, to suit his needs. He wanted to separate us. To break our bond.
But why?
Ioan asked, her brow furrowed in confusion. Because together, Kaelin said, his voice low, we were a threat. Twins born under the sign of the Frostborn possess a unique power. A power that rivals even the sorcerers. He knew that if we were united, we could defeat him. Ioan looked at them, her mind racing.
Twins.
A unique power. A threat to the sorcerer. It was all so much to take in. So the sorcerer, he trapped Alaric's soul inside you, Ioan said, her voice trembling slightly. To keep you apart. To weaken you both. Kaelin nodded, his expression grim. He did, he said. And he almost succeeded. But he underestimated one thing. The power of love. Love? Ioan looked at him, her heart pounding in her chest. What did he mean? The bond between twins, Alaric explained, his voice soft, is stronger than any magic. It transcends time, space, even death. It was that bond that kept me alive. That allowed me to connect with Kaelin. To guide him. To help him find you. Ioan felt a surge of understanding, of awe. The power of love, the bond between twins, had defied the sorcerer's magic, had kept Alaric's soul alive, had brought them all together. And the shadow blade, Ioan said, her gaze shifting to Kaelin's hand, where the dark blade had been sheathed. What is it? Kaelin hesitated, his gaze shifting away from hers. It's a part of Alaric, he finally said, his voice low. A manifestation of his power. His essence. It's a weapon. Forged in the shadows. To fight the darkness. It's a part of me? Alaric repeated. He was staring at Kaelin's side as if he could see through the sheath, through the fabric. Kaelin nodded. He began to draw the blade, slowly. He stopped halfway, and the air began to chill around it. It chose you, Alaric concluded, quietly, in awe. Kaelin nodded, sheathing the blade. The chilling air receded.
And now?
Ioan asked, her voice barely a whisper. Now that Alaric is free, what happens to the blade? To your connection? Kaelin looked at Alaric, a silent question in his eyes. Alaric smiled, a genuine smile, a smile that spoke of peace. The blade is yours, Kaelin, he said. It has chosen you. It is a part of you now. And our connection it will remain. We are brothers.
Twins.
Bound by fate, by destiny, by love. We will always be connected. Ioan felt a surge of relief, of joy. They were free. They were together. They were a family. But as Kaelin looked at Ioan, she saw something else, something behind his joy. There is one more secret, Ioan, he began, but then he stopped. Tell me, she said, firmly. Chapter 17. The Heart's True North. Kaelin hesitated, his gaze shifting between Ioan and Alaric, his expression a mixture of apprehension and determination. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for the revelation, for the truth. The prophecy, he began, his voice low, his silver eyes fixed on Ioan's. The prophecy of the Frostborn, it speaks of more than just breaking the curse. It speaks of a union that will restore balance to the land, that will bring lasting peace. Ioan felt a knot of anticipation tighten in her stomach. She had a feeling she knew where this was going, but she needed to hear him say it, needed to understand. A union? She repeated, her voice barely a whisper. Between whom? Kaelin reached out and gently took her hand, his touch sending a familiar jolt of energy through her, a warmth that spread through her veins, a connection that transcended words. Between the Frostborn, he said softly, and the one who holds the shadow blade. Between you and me. Eowyn stared at him, her heart pounding in her chest. She had suspected, she had hoped, but to hear him say it, to acknowledge the connection, the bond, the love, it was overwhelming. But Alaric, she said, her gaze shifting to his brother, her voice filled with concern. The blade, it's a part of him. Doesn't that mean? Alaric smiled, a gentle, understanding smile, a smile that spoke of acceptance. The blade chose Kaelin, he said. It is his destiny.
And yours, Eowyn.
To be together. To unite your powers.
To rule.
Rule? The word sent a shiver down Eowyn's spine. She had never sought power, had never desired to lead. She was an herbalist, a woman of the earth, a healer. Not a queen. I don't know, she said, her voice trembling slightly. I'm not a ruler. I'm not prepared for that. Kaelin squeezed her hand, his touch reassuring, his gaze filled with love, with belief.
You are, Eowyn, he said softly.
You have the strength, the compassion, the wisdom. You are the Frostborn. You are the one. And you will not be alone. I will be with you. Always. His words, his presence, his love, gave her the strength she needed, the courage to accept her destiny. She was the Frostborn. She had broken the curse. She had healed the land. And she would rule. With Kaelin by her side. But what about you, Alaric? She asked, looking at Kaelin's twin.
He smiled warmly.
My path lies elsewhere. Now that I am free, I will forge it. But know this, I will always be there for both of you, whenever you need me. Eowyn nodded, understanding. She looked back at Kaelin, at the love in his eyes, at the promise of a future together, a future of peace, of prosperity, of love. Together, she said, her voice firm, her heart filled with hope. We will rule together. Kaelin smiled, a genuine smile, a smile that reached his eyes, a smile that spoke of forever. He leaned in and kissed her, a soft, tender kiss, a kiss that sealed their bond, their destiny, their love. It was a kiss that tasted of spring, of renewal, of hope. It was a kiss that promised a future filled with challenges, but also with triumphs. A future together. As they broke the kiss, a soft, warm breeze swept through the land, carrying with it the scent of blossoms, the sound of birdsong, the promise of a new beginning. The unending winter was over. The curse was broken. The land was healed. And Eowyn, the Frostborn, the herbalist, the queen, stood hand in hand with Kaelin, the shadow blade wielder, the protector, the king, ready to face the future, together, their hearts united, their destinies intertwined, their love eternal. But as they stood there, bathed in the golden light of the rising sun, a single, dark raven circled overhead, its caw echoing through the stillness, a reminder that even in the brightest of days, shadows can linger. What did this omen portend? Was their journey truly over? Or was this just the beginning of a new chapter, a new challenge? Chapter 18. Where the wild winds blow. The raven's caw, sharp and unsettling, echoed through the newly awakened land, a discordant note in the symphony of spring. Eowyn looked up, her hand instinctively reaching for Kaelin's, her heart filled with a flicker of unease. What does it mean? She asked, her voice barely a whisper, her gaze fixed on the circling bird. Kaelin followed her gaze, his expression thoughtful, his silver eyes narrowed against the bright sunlight. Ravens are often seen as messengers, he said slowly. Omens of change. Of things to come. Good or bad? Eowyn asked, her voice trembling slightly. He hesitated, his gaze shifting away from the raven, back to her. It depends, he said. On the context. On the message. The raven circled once more, then flew off towards the north, towards the distant mountains, its dark silhouette disappearing against the pale blue sky. Alaric, who had been watching silently, stepped forward, his expression serious. The north, he said, his voice low. That's where the sorcerer's power originated. From the frozen peaks. The frozen peaks. Eowyn had heard whispers of them, tales of a desolate, icy wasteland, a place of ancient magic, of hidden dangers. What do you think it means? Eowyn asked, turning to Alaric, her voice filled with apprehension. He shrugged, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. Perhaps the sorcerer's influence is not entirely gone, he said. Perhaps there are remnants, echoes, of his power. Or something else, Kaelin added, his voice thoughtful. Something connected to the sorcerer. Something we don't yet know. Eowyn felt a knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. She had hoped that defeating the sorcerer, breaking the curse, would be the end of it. But it seemed their journey was not yet over. What should we do? She asked, her gaze shifting between Kaelin and Alaric. Kaelin took a deep breath, his expression determined. We investigate, he said. We go to the frozen peaks. We find out what the raven was trying to tell us. We make sure that the sorcerer's influence is truly gone. Eowyn nodded, her heart filled with a mixture of fear and resolve. She had faced impossible odds before. She had defeated a powerful sorcerer. She had healed the land. She could do this.
She would do this.
Together, she said, her voice firm, her hand tightening around Kaelin's. Alaric smiled, a supportive, encouraging smile. Together, they set off towards the north, towards the frozen peaks, the three of them, accompanied by the wolves, who had remained silently by their side, their loyalty unwavering, their presence a comfort. As they walked, the landscape began to change, the lush greenery of the newly awakened spring gradually giving way to a more rugged, barren terrain. The air grew colder, the wind sharper, the shadows longer. They walked for days, following the path laid out by the raven, by fate, by destiny. They encountered no further signs of the sorcerer's influence, no Draugr, no Frostbound. But the sense of unease, of anticipation, remained. They reached the foothills of the frozen peaks, a towering range of snow-capped mountains that pierced the sky, their peaks shrouded in mist, their slopes covered in ice and snow. It was a desolate, forbidding landscape, a place of ancient power, of hidden secrets. As they began their ascent, the wind grew stronger, the cold more intense, the silence more profound. The wolves, their fur bristling, stayed close to Eowyn, their senses alert, their bodies tense. They found a small cave, sheltered from the wind, where they decided to make camp for the night. Kaelin built a fire, the flames flickering and dancing, casting dancing shadows on the cave walls, providing a much-needed source of warmth and light. Eowyn sat by the fire, gazing out at the snow-covered landscape, her heart filled with a mixture of apprehension and determination. She had come so far, she had faced so much, she had changed so much. She was no longer the quiet herbalist, the woman who hid from the world. She was the Frostborn, the queen, the savior. Kaelin sat beside her, his arm around her, his touch a reassuring presence, his silence a comfort. He knew what she was thinking, what she was feeling. He understood. Are you afraid? He asked softly, his silver eyes meeting hers. Eowyn hesitated, then nodded. Yes, she admitted. But I'm also determined. I won't let fear control me. I won't let the sorcerer win. Not this time. Kaelin smiled, a gentle, loving smile. I know, he said. You are the strongest woman I know. And I love you. Eowyn felt a surge of warmth, of love, of hope. She leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder, her heart filled with gratitude, with peace. I love you too, she whispered. They sat there for a long moment, embraced in the warmth of the fire, the silence of the cave, the love that bound them together. Alaric, who had been sitting quietly by the entrance of the cave, watching the landscape, suddenly stood up, his body tense, his senses alert. What is it? Kaelin asked, his voice low, his hand reaching for his blade. Alaric pointed towards the distant peaks, his gaze fixed on something unseen. I feel something, he said, his voice trembling slightly. A presence. A power. It's faint, but it's there. In the highest peak. In the heart of the frozen peaks. Eowyn felt a shiver run down her spine. The heart of the frozen peaks. The source of the sorcerer's power. the place where the raven had led them. "We go there," she said, her voice firm, her heart filled with resolve. "Tomorrow, we face whatever awaits us. Together." Kaelin and Alaric nodded, their expressions determined, their hearts united, their destinies intertwined. As the wind howled outside the cave, carrying with it the whispers of the ancient mountains, the secrets of the past, the promise of the future, Eowyn knew that their journey was far from over. But she also knew that, together, they could overcome anything. Even a howling wind whispering secrets through the mountains. Chapter 19. The Thaw of a Frozen Heart. The ascent to the heart of the frozen peaks was arduous, a treacherous climb through ice and snow, against a biting wind that threatened to tear them from the mountainside. The air was thin and cold, making each breath a struggle, each step a victory. Eowyn, despite her connection to winter, felt the chill seep into her bones, a reminder of the raw, untamed power of the mountains, of the lingering influence of the sorcerer. But she pressed on, driven by a sense of purpose, by a determination to end this, once and for all. Kaelin walked beside her, his hand always within reach, his presence a source of strength, of comfort, of love. He was her anchor, her protector, her king. Alaric, despite his lack of magical power, proved to be a surprisingly adept climber, his years of experience in the harsh northern wilderness serving him well. He guided them, pointing out the safest paths, warning them of hidden dangers, his knowledge invaluable. The wolves, their thick fur providing protection against the cold, stayed close to Eowyn, their senses alert, their bodies tense, their presence a reassurance. As they climbed higher, the landscape grew even more desolate, the snow deeper, the ice more treacherous, the silence more profound. The only sounds were the howling wind, the crunch of their boots on the snow, the occasional caw of a raven, circling overhead. They reached a narrow ledge, overlooking a vast chasm, a seemingly bottomless abyss that dropped down into the heart of the mountain. The wind howled through the chasm, creating an eerie, unsettling sound, a whisper of the ancient magic that permeated the place. "This is it," Alaric said, his voice low, his gaze fixed on the opposite side of the chasm, where a large, imposing cave entrance was visible, carved into the sheer rock face. The heart of the frozen peaks. The sorcerer's lair. Eowyn felt a shiver run down her spine. The sorcerer's lair. The place where it all began. The place where it would all end. "How do we get across?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly, her gaze fixed on the vast expanse of empty space that separated them from their destination. Kaelin pointed towards a narrow, precarious-looking ice bridge that spanned the chasm, a fragile, translucent arch that seemed to defy gravity. "That is our only option," he said, his voice grim. "But it's dangerous. The ice is thin. It could collapse at any moment." Eowyn looked at the ice bridge, her heart pounding in her chest. It was a terrifying prospect, a leap of faith. But she knew they had no choice. We have to try," she said, her voice firm, her gaze meeting Kaelin's. "We've come this far. We can't turn back now." Kaelin nodded, his expression determined. "Together," he said, his hand tightening around hers. They started across the ice bridge, slowly, cautiously, each step carefully placed, their bodies tense, their senses alert. The ice groaned and creaked beneath their weight, threatening to give way at any moment. Halfway across, the wind picked up, buffeting them, threatening to throw them off balance, to send them plummeting into the abyss below. Eowyn felt a surge of fear, her grip tightening on Kaelin's hand. "Don't look down," Kaelin said, his voice calm, his gaze fixed on the opposite side of the chasm.
"Just focus on me."
"On my voice. We'll make it." Eowyn nodded, her eyes locked on his, her trust in him unwavering. She focused on his voice, on his touch, on his love, letting it guide her, strengthen her, protect her. They reached the other side, their legs trembling, their hearts pounding, their bodies drenched in a cold sweat. They had made it. They had survived. They stood before the cave entrance, a gaping maw in the rock face, a portal to the unknown. The air emanating from the cave was cold, not just physically, but spiritually. It was a cold that seeped into your soul, a cold that spoke of ancient evil, of lingering power. Ready? Kalen asked, his voice low, his hand resting on the hilt of his shadow blade. Eowyn nodded, her hand reaching for his, her heart filled with a mixture of fear and determination.
Ready, she said.
Together, they entered the cave, stepping into the darkness. The cave was vast and cavernous, the air thick with the smell of ice and decay. The only light came from the faint, ethereal glow emanating from Eowyn's hands, casting dancing shadows on the rough stone walls. As they walked deeper into the cave, they began to see remnants of the sorcerer's presence. Strange symbols carved into the walls, frozen pools of water that seemed to glow with an unnatural light, skeletal remains of creatures that had once served the sorcerer. They reached a large, central chamber, a vast, circular space that seemed to be the heart of the cave. In the center of the chamber, there was a pedestal, upon which rested a single, frozen object. It was a heart, a human heart, encased in ice. But it wasn't just frozen, it was pulsating, with a faint, rhythmic beat, a slow, steady throb that seemed to resonate with the very air around them. The sorcerer's heart, Alaric whispered, his voice filled with awe and horror. It's still beating. Kalen drew his blade, the shadow blade.
He looked at Eowyn. It was time.
Chapter 20. The Dawn of Everlasting Spring. The frozen heart, pulsating with a faint, rhythmic beat, was a grotesque symbol of the sorcerer's lingering power, a testament to his twisted magic, a reminder of the darkness they had fought so hard to overcome. Eowyn stared at the heart, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind filled with a mixture of revulsion and determination. She had to destroy it. She had to end this, once and for all. Kalen, his shadow blade drawn, its dark metal absorbing the faint light, stood beside her, his presence a source of strength, of comfort, of love. He was ready. They were ready. What do we do? Eowyn asked, her voice barely a whisper, her gaze fixed on the pulsating heart. Alaric stepped forward, his expression serious, his voice filled with ancient knowledge. The heart is the source of his power, he said. It's what keeps him bound to this land. To destroy it is to release him, to end his influence forever. But how? Eowyn asked, her brow furrowed in confusion. It's frozen. Solid ice. Not just any ice, Alaric corrected. Sorcerer's ice. It's imbued with his magic. It cannot be melted by ordinary means. But I'm not ordinary, Eowyn said, her voice firm, her gaze shifting from the heart to Kalen, her eyes filled with determination. I'm the Frostborn. I control the ice. I can break it. Kalen nodded, his silver eyes meeting hers, his expression filled with belief, with love. You can, Eowyn, he said softly. You have the power. And I'm here to protect you. Eowyn took a deep breath, focusing her will, channeling the energy that flowed through her, the power of the Frostborn, the power of her mother, the power of love. She raised her hands, feeling the familiar tingle, the subtle hum of power, the warmth that spread through her veins. She focused on the frozen heart, on the sorcerer's magic that permeated it, on the darkness that resided within. She reached out with her power, seeking to connect with the ice, to control it, to break it. The ice resisted, at first, pushing back against her will, a cold, unyielding force that seemed to defy her power. But Eowyn persisted, drawing on her inner strength, on her connection to the land, on her love for Kalen, for Alaric, for the world. Slowly, gradually, the ice began to respond. Cracks appeared on its surface, spider webbing across the frozen heart, spreading like tendrils of hope. The pulsating beat grew faster, more erratic, as if the heart sensed its impending destruction. Eowyn intensified her power, channeling all her energy, all her will, all her love, into the frozen heart. The cracks grew wider, deeper, the ice groaning and creaking, threatening to shatter. Suddenly, a dark, Viscous mist began to seep from the cracks, swirling and writhing, forming a shadowy figure above the heart. It was the sorcerer, or rather what was left of him. A specter, a remnant of his former power. "You cannot defeat me," he shrieked, his voice a distorted, echoing whisper, his form flickering and unstable. "I am eternal. I am power." Eowyn ignored him, focusing on the heart, on the ice, on her power. She would not be deterred. She would not fail. With a final, concentrated burst of energy, she shattered the ice, breaking the frozen heart into 1,000 pieces, releasing the last vestiges of the sorcerer's power. The shadowy figure shrieked, a sound of pure, unadulterated terror, as it was consumed by the light, by the warmth, by the power of the Frostborn. It dissipated, fading away, vanishing into nothingness, leaving behind only silence. The cave was filled with a soft, ethereal glow, emanating from Eowyn, from the shattered remnants of the frozen heart, from the very air around them. The cold was gone, replaced by a gentle warmth, a sense of peace, a feeling of completion. Eowyn lowered her hands, her body trembling with exhaustion, her energy depleted, but her heart filled with triumph. She had done it. She had destroyed the sorcerer's heart. She had ended his reign of terror. She had saved the world. Kaelin rushed to her side, embracing her, holding her tight, his body trembling against hers. "You did it, Eowyn," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. You are incredible." She clung to him, burying her face in his shoulder, tears streaming down her face, tears of relief, of joy, of love. They had done it, together. Alaric stepped forward, his expression filled with awe, with gratitude, with hope. "The balance is restored," he said softly. "The land can heal. Spring will truly return." And as he spoke, a soft, warm breeze swept through the cave, carrying with it the scent of blossoms, the sound of birdsong, the promise of a new beginning. The unending winter was over. The curse was broken. The land was healed. And a new era had begun. Eowyn and Kaelin, hand in hand, stepped out of the cave into the bright sunlight of a new dawn. They looked out at the land, at the melting snow, at the budding trees, at the vibrant colors of spring, their hearts filled with hope, with love, with joy. They had faced the darkness. They had fought the shadows. They had won. And now, together, they would rule. They would lead. They would love. And they would ensure the everlasting spring would endure. As they stepped into the sunlight, a beautiful rainbow arched across the sky, the promise of a future filled with beauty, but also challenge. They were ready. Epilogue. Years passed, flowing like the river that Eowyn had freed, each season a testament to the enduring spring she and Kaelin had ushered in. The land flourished, healed and vibrant, a reflection of their reign, a reign built not on power, but on compassion, on wisdom, on love. Eowyn, no longer the quiet herbalist, but the revered Frostborn queen, ruled with a gentle strength, her decisions guided by the wisdom of the earth, by the whispers of the wind, by the counsel of her beloved king. Kaelin, his shadow blade rarely drawn, stood by her side, his strength a shield, his love a beacon, his presence a constant reassurance. He was her protector, her confidant, her soulmate. Alaric, freed from his centuries-long imprisonment, found his own path, becoming a trusted advisor, a wise counselor, a bridge between the old ways and the new. He traveled the land, sharing his knowledge, healing the wounds of the past, forging a future of unity and understanding. The wolves, their wild spirits a symbol of the untamed beauty of the land, remained their loyal companions, their howls a reminder of the ancient magic that flowed through the realm, a testament to the bond between the Frostborn and the creatures of the wild. Children were born, their laughter echoing through the halls of the once silent castle, their eyes reflecting the promise of a bright future, a future free from the shadow of the sorcerer, a future filled with hope. Eowyn and Kaelin watched their children grow, teaching them the ways of the land, the importance of balance, the power of love. They instilled in them the values that had guided their own reign, the values that would ensure the enduring peace they had fought so hard to achieve. One crisp autumn evening, as the leaves turned golden and the air grew crisp with the scent of wood smoke, Eowyn and Kaelin stood on the balcony of their castle, overlooking the vibrant landscape, their hands intertwined, their hearts filled with gratitude, with peace, with love. Their children were playing in the courtyard below, their laughter echoing through the twilight, a sound that filled Eowyn's heart with joy. Alaric sat nearby, watching them with a gentle smile, his presence a constant reminder of the bonds of family, of the resilience of the human spirit. "It's perfect," Eowyn whispered, her voice filled with awe, her gaze fixed on the setting sun, painting the sky in hues of orange and gold. Kaelin nodded, his arm tightening around her, his touch a reassuring presence, his love a constant warmth. "It is," he agreed. "And it's all thanks to you." Eowyn smiled, turning to look at him, her eyes filled with love, with gratitude, with understanding. "Not just me," she said softly. "Us. Together. We did this." He leaned in and kissed her, a soft, tender kiss, a kiss that spoke of years of shared joys and sorrows, of unwavering loyalty, of enduring love. It was a kiss that tasted of home, of peace, of forever. As they stood there, embraced in the twilight, the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, twinkling like diamonds scattered across a velvet cloth. They were a reminder of the vastness of the universe, of the infinite possibilities that lay ahead, of the enduring power of hope. And Eowyn, the Frostborn queen, the woman who had defeated the sorcerer, who had healed the land, who had found her destiny, knew that, together, with Kaelin by her side, with Alaric as their guide, with their children as their hope, they could face anything. They had brought the spring. And that spring, in their hearts, and in the hearts of their children, and in the heart of their land, would last forever. The final image was of Eowyn gently touching her stomach, a subtle, secret smile on her face. The end.